Welcome back. We get started again. Delighted you're all here. I'm joined by a very distinguished group of experts on Iran. The first panel focuses on the election of President Raisi and its various consequences in terms of what that means for the Iranian state, what it means for ethnic politics inside the country, and what it portends for the reformist camp in Iran. So we will start with Mr. Amir Mahdavi. Each of the panelists would speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Mr. Mahdavi.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to present among this distinguished set of scholars, and I am so delighted to present in this conference today. Today I'm going to talk under the title of the 2021 presidential election as a turning point . Great. The 2021 presidential election as a turning point in the typology of the Islamic Republic. So basically, the question here is whether the 2021 election will be able to assist us in reclassifying Iran within the spectrum of regime types. To put it in another way, what is about this election that make it unique and may influence how political science literature examine Iran's state structure in future. Then in future. In the next part, that would be a brief survey of how comparativists have categorized Iran's government type so far. Then I will discuss the indicators of the erosion of electoral autocracy that led to the unique election of 2021. And in the next segment, I would argue that the 2021 election was a turning point that allowed a scholar to employ hegemonic authoritarianism as the new terminology for discussing Iran's politics. Lastly, I propose three subcategories of hegemonic state that may be applied to Iran's near future political structure. Just for the matter of clarification, when we are talking about the electoral authoritarian system and hegemonic authoritarian system, we define them as a subcategories of hybrid regime, and the three scenarios that I will address at the end of my lecture would be personalist regime, single party regime, and military regime as three subcategories of a hegemonic authoritarian states. There is a consensus on the regime type of Islamic Republic, at least in the 2 decades among the scholars, based on which characteristics have the scholars formed a relative consensus that the Islamic Republic falls within the category of electoral authoritarianism, hybrid regime. This is the regime type that comes in the literature under other terms such as semi-authoritarianism and electoral authoritarianism as well. Elections are contested among the regime's loyal political elites. This is the first characteristics that we saw in the Iranian political structure in the last 25 years at least. Since the second presidential election in 1981, no outsider has been permitted to run for the presidency. The other characteristic is that limited factions take part in a competitive race. So although the election is limited for the faction and candidates who are allowed to run, in every presidential election in the past quarter century, the two major camps of reformists and principalists, once called by the supreme leader as the two wings of the regime, have competed with each other. The other characteristic is unfair access to resources. However, elections were unfair in terms of campaign finance and access to public resources such as TV, radio, and space for campaign rallies. We saw this trajectory in the past 8 elections. And the last characteristic is that underlying policies are not determined by electorate. So as Dr. Mousavian clearly elaborated in his presentation early today, issues mostly related to the national security, such as foreign policy, are not determined by elections. Elections cannot significantly shift sensitive policies related to security, defense, and foreign policy, although elections have been an influential factor on decision making in these areas. Now, we are seeing a departure from electoral autocracy, and I am going to argue that the 2021 election was a critical juncture and turning point in that departure. There are elements in the trajectory of late 2010 decade that paralyzed the electoral autocracy system in Iran and paved the way for the drastic change in the governance since the last year election. The first one is economic. In the 10 years before the election, the annual GDP growth average was only 0.6%, while the average GDP growth for the entire world was 2.4% during that period. The GDP per capita shrank from 7,700 in 2011 to only 2,500 in 2020. The inflation rate in 2020 was about 37%, which was 60% higher than its 22% average during 2010s, the 6th highest rates in the world. Moreover, the population living under poverty line increased from about 20% in 2011 to 1/3 of the population just before Raisi's election. The other important topic is historic frequency and vast geographic distribution of unrests in the years before the election. Just 1.5 years before the 2021 election, the deadliest unrest in the history of Islamic Republic occurred. An abrupt spike in the gas price sparked nationwide unrest that resulted in more than 300 casualties. Actually, this number is a number that is accepted by the Iranian officials. In terms of frequency and geographic distribution, the protest that began in 2020 was unprecedented. In the context of the two above causes, the hostile conflict between elected administration, President Rouhani administration, and the other part of the state escalated to an extraordinary level. As an example that everyone remembers, while the economic situation and the pandemic were dramatically affected Iran, President Rouhani made it clear that his powerful challenger didn't allow the nuclear sanction to be relieved in the early months of President Biden in office. Also, and maybe most important than the other factors, the matter of succession of the supreme leader when the leader turns to 82 has become an unignorable aspect of political discussion in Iran. Every major political development is being interpreted in the context of succession today. And even members of Assembly of Experts, I'm talking about a body that is in charge of picking the supreme leader, have acknowledged that a committee in the Assembly is working on a short list of possible successors. A peaceful succession requires a unified power that can marginalize potential challengers. Now, in light of these causes and roots, we are looking for a new terminology that the 2021 allows us to use for the Islamic Republic. The election was unusual enough to be named as heralding a change in the style of Iranian politics by Professor Kamrava's 2021 article, and considered the transformation from Islamic Republic to Islamic States by another Iranian scholar, Dr. Saeed Golkar, in his recent paper. Here I review the three major oddities of this election that allows scholars to think about that as a turning point. The 2001 election had a 48 voter turnout, the lowest since the first presidential election in 1980. For the first time, 13% of ballots were either blank or voided. The vote share of the winner has always been between 70 and 75% in the presidential election in Iran. In 2021, similar to previous times, the winner gained 62. But what allows us to call a hegemonic election, to call this particular election a hegemonic one, was that the exceptional absence of the official coalition of reformists in this election. This was a major change, unlike the rest of the election in the past 25 years, and especially the vote share of the second candidate, which was only 11%. Another strange issue with respect to the election was that for the first time, no one in the core of the power seemed upset about the low turnout. This was a pretty new phenomenon. The Speaker of the Guardian Council asserted that the low voter participation wouldn't delegitimize the election. In a similar spirit, the advisor of IRGC's commander announced his satisfaction with the results and asserted that the low turnout reflected the wisdom of the people because they didn't want to vote to wrong candidates. There were important indicators. They were important indicators because after every election in the past 25 years, the leader and his circle has praised the high participation rate regardless of voters' choice of candidates. These statements become more meaningful when we read them in the context of leaders' position regarding the presidential election per se. In 2011, the Supreme Leader mentioned that at some point, parliamentary system might be more appropriate than presidential system for elected officials of the executive branch. 10 years later, more importantly, after the last election, the Supreme Leader questioned the value of election by saying that although democracy is attainable through the electoral process, elections may become meaningless in future. Now, I am looking to, sorry if I try to be so summarized and precise. I am trying to convey a gist of about a 10,000 word paper here. Now I am going to talk about the three possible scenarios that are in front of us about the future of the political structure of Islamic Republic. So three subcategories of a hegemonic state that might be the future of the Islamic Republic. One of them, a mixture of two of them, or a combination of all three. First, I am going to talk about personalistic states. The post-221 state has the underlying characteristic of a hegemonic autocracy. Elections formally occurred in this type of governments, but there was almost no room for challenging the incumbent. Election results are usually predictable, and the incumbent as a person, a faction, or a party gets elected repeatedly. The other candidates plays only roles in an incumbent re-election game because they often don't have political capital or access to the resources, as we saw about the rivals of Ebrahim Raisi in the 2001 election. In the past year, there was no rhetorical challenge from within the administration and within the government to what the leader wanted to implement. In an illustrative statement, President Raisi said, "The supreme leader is the commander and we are the soldiers who ought to execute the commands." The other clue is that the function of legislature has been reduced to ratify what aligns with the leader's will. Also, the judicial branch has been manipulated to function as a tool for controlling opposition. The constitutional check and balances have almost faded, and the three branches have degraded into divisions of the Supreme Leader's office. In addition, from a while ago, by publishing books with titles like A Qualified Politician, Women's Role Mandates, and the Characteristic of a Hezbollahi Youth, the Supreme Leader tries to provide loyal followers with an ideological toolbox that applies to every aspect of life like a cult of personality. This is one of the very highlighted characteristic of a personalist system. Also, there are signs the Islamic Republic is likely to become a patrimonial personalist hegemonic state. Debates around the issue recently sparked again as the former prime minister highlighted the plan for the succession of the second son of the current supreme leader. It is a claim that have never been officially denied. The other type which we can expect with the evidence that we have about the current situation and post-2021 situation of Islamic Republic is having a single-party hegemonic state. The Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, is prepared to carry out many of the functions of a classical ruling party. The IRGC gradually become a government within government, involved in media, banking, defense, security, industry, health sector, construction, and almost every aspect of governance. It might not be ready to take over the whole state, but it is fair to say no other administration will be able to function without cooperation with IRGC. The IRGC's vertical and horizontal infiltration of society functions as a way of material patronage and state position distribution among loyal elites and masses. So this is a very classic function of a single party system in which the party's cells in a cluster-like hierarchy infiltrates in every sector of society. We see that about the Communist Party in China, for instance, that they have units in every sector of the society, and those units works as a mean of distribution of patronage, privileges, and positions. This mandate is being accomplished via passage branches in every sector and every occupation. We have passage of artists, lawyers, athletes, laborers, farmers, engineers, and its geographical units go from metropolis area to low-populated rural areas. The other worth mentioning consideration is what that single-party system also make, this is the positive one actually, autocracies durable by enhancing the quality of governance. In a personalist autocracy, leaders may often change their mind, jeopardizing the stability required for a functioning governance. However, the hierarchical structure of a ruling party prevents the leader from initiating abrupt policy shifts. But there is a little evidence, maybe with the exception of nuclear negotiation, to prove that these benefits of a single party system are being realized in Iran. The last regime type that I am going to talk about is military regime. Actually, the unprecedented frequency of economic demand-driven protest and two nationwide unrest in 2018 and 2020 have given more importance to the security forces in general, namely the IRGC. More protests usually caused more state repression, and IRGC gained supremacy vis-a-vis other government institutions. When security becomes a priority, of course, security sector and defense sectors gain an upper hand in the administration. Also, there are significant lessons IRGC may learn from Arab Spring. During the Arab Spring, the regime The regimes demonstrated more resilience where those had more professionals, military apparatus, and their social composition of the military was different from the majority of the population. The case we saw in Syria, Bahrain, and some other Arab countries. This difference between the social composition of military forces and the majority could be compared to the cult-like corps members in Iran. Now IRGC members are particular subculture subculture with unified dressing, the unified form of bird style, and even exclusive entertainment sites and social centers, schools, and university that separate them from the majority of the society. That makes them more prone to equalize their class and personal interest with the regime's security. Also, in addition to that, distributing commodity to low-income people, especially from the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, and taking part in COVID-19 combat by developing health facilities and even producing a COVID-19 vaccine gave a leverage to IRGC in administrative issues. In the post-Raisi election, it is difficult to distinguish the regime from the military and security apparatus from the administration. This is the very characteristic of a military regime. Like other military regimes, a major part of parliament member, ministers, and governors are former IRGC member. More and more we see generals who put their uniform aside and join the administration, join the parliament, and vice versa. So I am going to have the last quick review on 4 implications of all of these developments. The first implication that I would expect is that as a potential elites become less represented of the nation, the path of information from the bottom to the top of the society become narrower, and fewer different political views would be able to negotiate with the supreme leader and the core of the power. Electoral rotation of power helps overcome the potential mistrust between the leader and elites in every undemocratic countries. So with the absence of electoral rotation of the power, we may see more mistrust between the elites and political elites and the leader. Faith and obedience to the successor driven by a minority regime would be obviously less than what his 2 predecessors received. It is high likely that the next supreme leader would have neither charismatic legitimacy carried from the 1979 revolution nor high status in the Shia cleric hierarchy. And the last point is that, however, in a comparative perspective, better economic performance after the eradication of contested electoral system could be expected. This might be a good news. It is less costly for autocratic leaders to seek economic growth policies because they are free from pressure of re-election. Thus, they can resist the majority demands for redistribution and can focus on long-term developmental strategies and policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we have Professor Ahmadi from Tehran University. I should say I'm most grateful for keeping to time. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I'm sure Professor Ahmadi will also keep to time.
Maybe less than that.
Maybe less than
Okay.
that. More time for Q&A.
Okay. First, let me to thanks the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and then the Iranian Studies Unit, and my friend Professor Kamrava for inviting me to attend this conference. As you see, the subject of my lecture is somehow different to other lectures, and it is also a complicated issue because it is related to one of the issues in contemporary Iranian politics that has been less studied, but there are images about that and some hypotheses around. In order to come to Raisi presidency during the last year, it is necessary to have a background of this issue because the issue of ethnicity and ethnic politics in Iran. The general image which has been created by the research which has been done on this is that Iran is composed of many different ethnic groups with different languages, and that they have independent identities and cultures, and they are struggling to have the right in terms of self-determination and independence and things like that. And this is dominated in Iranian studies around the world. And for several decades, this has been discussed and repeated here and there. But the argument that I'm raising is different. I have written an article about 15 years ago and the title was The Dynamism of National Identity in Iran. So this, the concept of Iran unity in diversity, which is, although there is diversity in terms of language, religion, dialects, everything, but there is a strong national identity in Iran that has kept the country strong in terms of culture, in terms of national solidarity. And if the essentialist approach which present Iran as a diversified country full of ethnic groups unfamiliar with each other and struggling to be self-determinated or independent. If that was true, Iran had never existed until now. So why it has been existed and very strong? Because there is another fact behind that. The fact is that this essentialist approach, or I would like to foundationalist approach, which consider Iran as a diversified, ethnic, bounded society struggling for independence and things like that, is a modern notion, is a modern approach. And actually it has come basically from the Marxist-Leninist discourse in the early 20th century. And it is not true about Iran, but also about other countries in the region, Pakistan, Iraq, Turkey. They have the emergence of ethnicity as a political phenomenon is strongly related to this Marxist-Leninist discourse, which came not from the original Marxism or European Marxism, but from the Russian Marxism. That was different to that. If you look at Marx and the European Marxist or neo-Marxist discourses, they consider ethnicity as an instrument of capitalism. But if you go to Marxist-Leninism, ethnicity is a revolutionary force, which is a source for exporting the Soviet or socialist revolution. So that was a kind of Russian requirement to elaborate on that discourse. And we know that when the Marxist-Leninist notion of self-determination became gradually dominant in the contemporary world, and it spread over the region, and And if you look at ethnic political organizations and groups around the region here in Iran, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, Turkey, Iraq, and other parts, maybe beyond to Asia, most of those political groups, the leaders have been Marxist-Leninists. Although they have been strong tribal groups, which according to Marxism, they are reactionary forces, but they have elaborated and promoted the Marxist-Leninist notion of self-determination in order to turn an ethnic group or linguistic group or religious group to a nation, and to be an independent nation, and then to be a friend of Soviet Union, that finally. So in Iran was the case like that. So in Iran, I'm not negating that we have no ethnic groups like Kurds, Azeris, and Baluch, Turkmens, and others. We have them, and we have had them in before, at least for several centuries they have been there, but there has not been an independent political movement coming from those regions in order to be self-determined or to be independent. On the other side, on the contrary, we have seen that how these Iranian groups like the Kurds and the Azeris, especially Bakhtiaris, Lors, and others, and even Baluchis, they have been an integral part of Iranian society, and they have contributed to the promotion of Iranian culture and Iranian independence vis-a-vis the foreign invasions during the last centuries, from the Safavid to the present time. So nobody is looking at this dimension of ethnicity in Iran. So the question of ethnic groups or ethnic groups is a modern nation. In Iran and the region, I'm talking about Iran, not a special case. This is general about the region, the Middle East and Asia. We had not this notion of ethnic groups, but tribal groups. What you see, for example, as Kurdistan or Baluchistan, Sistan or Baluchistan or Azerbaijan, either in Iran or in Iraq or in Turkey, all over, there has not been a unified population unit as, for example, although in terms of language there has been Kurds, but they have been divided to many tribes, that it has been a tribal society, and the tribal unit has been a fact that has existed in Iran and the region. For example, in Kurdistan, we have had several tribes who have been competing to each other and sometimes fighting to each other over different things. And they have had their own relation with the state. So before the emergence of the modern notion of ethnicity and ethnic groups, we have had tribal groups and the tribal leaders. For example, in Baluchistan, we had dozens of tribal groups, which usually in Baluchistan they call them ta'ifat than qaba'il. They don't say, maybe in Khuzestan they say qabila or qaba'il, but in Baluchistan they say ta'ifat. Different tawaifs who were competing to each other. Some of them were Sunnis, some of them were Shiis, and lots of dynamism within these territorial units. So the tribe was the fact, and none of those tribes have been trying to be independent, or they have struggling for self-determination before the mid-20th century. So we have had that. Before the rise of the modern state, Iran didn't have a national army. The army of Iran during the Safavid and the Afshari, Qajar, and was a kind of tribal army. Different tribes of Iran from all over the countries, they had the duty to send their armed men to the center when there was a fight, or for example, Iran-Russian wars. The Iranian army was composed of many tribal groups, have come from Khuzestan, the Iranian Arab tribal groups, from Sistan and Baluchistan, from Azerbaijan, from everywhere. And all of them, they were fighting for Iran under the leadership of the king. So the tribes have not been isolated societies with their own specific culture. So what has made Iran as a unified society, despite all these tribal groups or linguistic or religious groups, are several factors. One is the Iranian history, the notion of Iranian history, culture, and also a state. At the present time, if you ask Iranians, they are very proud of their history, from the ancient time to the time being, and they are promoting it. If you go to the virtual space, and you would see how they are interested in their history, and they are saying that we deserve a better situation with this kind of history. So the Iranian history from 2,500 years ago or more than that has unified Iranians. All of them are recognizing themselves and relating to that history. And then the Iranian culture, which is the basic factor on that, is the Persian language. The Persian language has been the national language of Iran from many centuries, even before the rise of Islam. Some people would think that even some Iranian scholars, they think that the present Persian or Farsi language is a combination of Arabic and Pahlavi language, which is not true. The present Farsi Dari, which that in Afghanistan and Tajikistan would say, or the Persian was the language of Iran even before Islam. And we have several books in the Arabian world, in the Arab world, like Subh al-A'sha. The book was written by Al-Qalqashandi in Egypt. There are many examples that how Farsi language has been spoken among Iranian. That I'm not going to talk about that. So it is a national language of Iran, and the language of poetry, and the language culture, language of historicity and writing history. And then the existence of a state in Iran, the kingship from the ancient time to the being. That is the representative of Iranian people. Although the state has its own specificities, it is a just state, not an authoritarian one. 2 minutes? Really? Okay. I thought I have talked 5 minutes. Okay. Because of that, I say that this is a complicated issue. Okay. In the contemporary times, in the last 2 decades, the ethnicity had been politicized by political elites in Iran, especially during the electoral times, because it is related to Raisi. And from 2005 and to the present time, to 2021, in the presidential elections, some political elites loyal to Islamic Republic have been using ethnicity as a source of mobilization to take votes. And that the ethnicity in the contemporary Iran have been raised by elites, first Marxist elites before the revolution, and after during the early days of revolution, the Marxist elites in Kurdistan, Baluchistan, Khuzestan, they raised the issue of ethnicity and violence. And later on, from 2005 actually, to the present time, the Islamic elites in Iran, whether basically reformist, they have used ethnicity in order to get votes based on this failed image that Iran is the same essentialist approach. You know, they are thinking the same. And for example, in 2005, the candidates like Karoubi, Mu'in and Mehran Kamrava, and then Ahmadinejad and Hashemi Rafsanjani. You know, Karoubi was promoting the idea of ethnic groups, and he wanted to mobilize them to get votes. And the same Mu'in was doing with the Sunnis in Iran, and also Mehran Kamrava, who was from Azerbaijan, who was saying that I am a Turk and we have 30 million of Turks, so I would be president. But the result was that, you know, what was the result at that time? The Mehran Kamrava got 4%, sorry, 4%. It has 0.4. Mu'in got 13%, and Karoubi got 17%, and Hashemi Rafsanjani and Ahmadinejad, they had more than 40%, something like that, you know. And the interesting things was that in Azerbaijan, the main cities of Azerbaijan, they didn't vote to Mehran Kamrava, who was promoting Turkishness against Farsis, but they voted for Ahmadinejad or Hashemi Rafsanjani. The same happened in 2009, which is again Karoubi came, and Ghalibaf and others, they raised the issue of ethnicity, but they didn't get vote. And in 2013, actually the same happened. You know, Ghalibaf was raising the issue of ethnicity, and Mohsen Rezai was raising, but all of them lost. And Rouhani, he got the most popular vote. Also, he raised some issues of ethnicity. In 2021, you know, 2 years ago, then again the issue of ethnicity became politicized. You know, Mohsen Rezai, for I think the 5th time or the 4th time he came, and you know, my friends, they have talked to him that you are for 2 decades, you are talking about ethnicity, Bakhtiaris, lower courts, and you don't get vote. You talk about Iranian national pride. But he didn't accept, no. Then he repeated. And also the candidate of the reformist Hemmati, he also raised Mehran Kamrava from 2005. Then again, he was a candidate. He was raising, when in the TV there was a program and discussion, they used to talk Turkish to say to the Azeris that I am a Turk, vote for me. And then all of them withdraw. And the Hemmati got 8%, you know. Rezai got 11%, and Raisi got 62%. I'm not saying that was democratic. I'm talking just about ethnicity. How this formula doesn't work. Why it doesn't work? Because this notion of national identity in Iran. Most of the students of Iranian politics in the contemporary time, they have forget that how this society has been continuing from several centuries to the present time.
Professor, if you would wrap
yeah,
up.
the last one. If Raisi didn't raise actually nothing about ethnic groups, and he is not raising that issue. But as far as you know, the Iranian political structure is not a unified one. You know, it's dispersed. You know, if we are not 1,000 islands, we have some islands. In every province, you have the state. On the other side, you have other structure which is related to the traditional structure, the supreme leaders. So it is still the issue of ethnicity is going on, but there has been many critiques in the last decade to those candidates who are raising the issue. And I think in the next presidential election, the situation would be different, because for 20 years, the political elites who were searching for power and get vote through ethnic elaboration, they failed. And they will fail in the future because they don't recognize the Iranian reality, what is in Iran, how strong is the issue of Iranianness, the sense to Iran. Iran maybe is different to Islamic Republic, you know. That is one thing, but Iran as a historical and cultural phenomenon, as a political heritage, that is totally different. So most Iranians, if they are Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, they are loyal to that, but to the states, maybe they have a different view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Ilkhom Mirzoev from the Center for Middle East Studies at the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences.
Thank you, Mr. Kamrava. I'm glad to welcome the participants and the audience of the conference, and would like to express my gratitude to the hosts of this conference, Iranian Studies Unit of the ACRPS Center for Research and Policy Making, and personally Professor Mehran Kamrava, for the provided opportunity to present my paper. Also, I'm thankful for the extensive support of the coordinators and events team, particularly the irrespectable Hamid Ahmadi and Motaz An-Nazar. Thank you. For the sake of saving time, with your permission, I will skip the details of the process and the results of the elections, and instead we'll go straight to the implications of the results of these elections for the reformist faction. How do I start this? Slideshow? Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. So, the overwhelming defeat in the 2021 elections made evident that the reformists have depleted their social capital, and even the number of empty ballots exceeded the number of votes for Abdul Nasser Hemmati, the sole reformist candidate left in the race. In the municipal elections, which were held simultaneously, reformists were also defeated. After the elections, reformists have once again torn at each other in search for the guilty party. Some accused the Guardian Council of arbitrary actions, others blamed their poor electoral performance on economic sanctions. At the same time, there were still those who pointed out the inadequacies of reformists' own conduct. Although the Guardian Council did play an instrumental role in removal of the most active reformist forces from participating in elections, the loss of trust of the electorate became an objective factor in their political marginalization. While the majority of the mainstream reformists were in favor of participating in elections, trying to avoid further political isolation, some of the factions' theorists declared an identity crisis of the reformists and the need to update their political platform and gain back the support of their core constituency. Thus, one of the prominent reformist activists, Alireza Alavi-Tabar, in his analysis of the reformists' current condition, lists the following factors that caused the current crisis. These are internal strifes and lack of a unified strategy, indecisiveness and conciliatory position of the reformist elite, corruption scandals involving high-ranking reformists, failures of Hassan Rouhani's centrist government, and election-centered strategy, when the issue of electoral participation has surpassed other aspects of political work that are educational activities, engagement with corporate associations, trade unions, and etc. Now, there is a common understanding among the reformists that the faction is undergoing the most severe crisis in its 25 years of existence. The current situation seems to be even worse than after the suppression of Green Movement in 2010. Because even though back then the authorities repressed the reformists, they still enjoyed significant public support, which was their main political resource of this faction. Now they depleted this resource, supporting Hassan Rouhani in 2013 and again in 2017. Now, after the perceived failure of Rouhani's government, the reformists have lost their credibility among the voters, and as a result, they became an easy target for political filtering at the hands of the conservative Guardian Council. Now the reformists are faced with a period of political isolation, and so far there are hardly any prospects for changing this situation within the current political cycle. Despite the relative consensus in assessing the current situation and its causes, the reformists do not have any unified strategy to overcome this crisis. In the current circumstances, the two main strategies can be distinguished in the reformist faction. The first is convergence with the ruling bloc, that is, efforts aimed at participation and cooptation in the ruling circle, characteristic of the moderate pro-state reformists, particularly the Kargozaran party. Supporters of this approach are convinced that in the current conditions of political clampdown, it is necessary to be closer to the authorities and to participate in the elections at all costs, if only to maintain presence in the political arena as a legitimate force. Supporters of this approach choose liberalization over democratization and expect to push the government towards economic reforms by advocating task-oriented policies. Within this framework, we witness attempts to restore the centrist reformist coalition on the part of the previous President Hassan Rouhani in cooperation with moderate conservatives such as Ali Larijani and Mohammad Reza Bahonar, as well as reformists represented by Mohammad Khatami. Also, the case of President Raisi's meeting with moderate and centrist political activists, including the high-ranking members of Kargozaran party in May this year, is also a case in point. The second approach is divergence from the establishment in an attempt to regroup and regain the trust of the voters. The main pole of attraction here is Ittihad-e-Millat party, the heir apparent of the Mushrikat party banned in 2010. Supporters of this approach say that the participation in the elections at all costs is meaningless, since the Iranian leadership is not primed for any changes, and any strong reformist candidate would simply not be allowed to participate. The reformists of this strand consider it their main objective to preserve their political identity, and therefore they opt for limited participation in elections, depending on the approval of their leading candidates by the Guardian Council. Also, they insist on the need to strengthen the institutions of civil society and promote reformist discourse in the public sphere. On its part, the leadership of the country may be interested in partial cooptation of the reformists, at least for two reasons, in my opinion. Firstly, the reformists could be instrumental in channelizing the popular discontent in a controlled fashion, while the imitation of political alternatives in the elections could temporarily boost the legitimacy of the regime and keep the political participation within the boundaries of the existing system. And secondly, the centrist reformist coalition, many members of which were educated in the West, could serve as a pool of qualified bureaucracy, which is a viable resource, especially in current dire economic conditions. However, it seems that the current system of power is arranged in such a way that even if reformist candidates gain control over the elected bodies, they still will not be able to fulfill their campaign promises due to the imbalance of unelected state institutions. Ultimately, it seems that their stay within the power system will only lead to another wave of disenchantment among the population. The current situation spurred heated discussions among the reformists on the means as well as the overall goals of this faction. In this regard, the debate between the two prominent reformists, Mustafa Tajzadeh and Said Hajarian, on the idea of structural reforms, as Lahat Sakhtari, has arguably been the most notable intellectual development in the reformist milieu of late. Initially, structural reforms was Tajzadeh's presidential campaign slogan during the 2021 elections. Although his candidacy was predictably brushed off by Guardian Council, Tajzadeh used his campaign as an opportunity to raise public awareness of Islamic Republic's political crisis and showcase his vision of dealing with it. Later, Tajzadeh restated his understanding of structural reforms as the need to develop a popular demand to compel the supreme leader to hold a referendum on constitutional reforms. These reforms would entail the change of Islamic Republic's foreign policy strategy, that is departure from fierce anti-Americanism, a more balanced cooperation with the world, focus on Iran's internal affairs rather than active promotion of regional agenda, and curtailing the power of supreme leader. Tajzadeh's campaign triggered lively debates in the reformist community regarding the expediency of this approach. The principal line of criticism here is the absence of a clear and detailed plan of reforms, as well as the lack of understanding regarding the conditions and circumstances needed for the mere implementation of these reforms. As rightly noted by Muhammad Reza Jalaipur, a reformist activist and one of the younger members of the Ittihad-e-Millat party, Tajzadeh's ideas seem appealing, but they deal more with a point of destination for Iran than with a path to it. In his turn, Tajzadeh notes that at the current stage it is necessary to identify the main problem, the root of all the troubles, if you will, which in Tajzadeh's opinion is hyper-concentration of power in the unalterable office of Supreme Leader. For Tajzadeh, it is necessary that the discourse of structural reforms first off prevails in the reformist community, and only after that comes the turn to address the issues of the practical implementation. In his words, it is vital to arrive at a consensus on diagnosis before assigning a treatment. The most substantial critique of Tajzadeh's vision of reforms, however, was offered by a renowned reformist tactician and theorist Said Hajarian. In his previous works, Hajarian voiced criticism of constitution-centered political strategy and various referendum projects, differentiating between the real, haqiqi, and legal, huquqi, structure of power in Iran. So his reflection on Tajzadeh's ideas is also based on this viewpoint. In Hajarian's opinion, it is the real power structure which is comprised of multiple political, economical, and cultural sets of rules that defines the constitution and not the other way around. Furthermore, given that laws in general can be understood and interpreted differently according to one's interested, Hajarian argues that before changing the legal structure, it is necessary to ensure a uniform reading and a uniform implementation of the existing constitution, even if it is undemocratic. Furthermore, Hajarian renders constitutionalism unrealistic in current circumstances and warns of negative implications of such strategy. Since the path to constitutional amendments lies through the office of the Supreme Leader, in the near term they can stage a rigged referendum and seize the initiative from the reformists. In the long run, this experience of consecutive failed efforts of the reformists would aggravate the sense of frustration and despair in the society that in turn leads to political apathy and atomization. Moreover, Hajarian believes that currently Iranians, especially the lower strata, are immersed in the everyday struggles, and most acute for them are economic issues that directly affect their lives. Under these circumstances, ideas like eliminating the Guardian Council's approbatory supervision or limiting the Supreme Leader term of office lack potential for social mobilization, according to Hajarian. In addition, popularization of these ideas depends on activities of independent media whose work is impeded in Iran. In his turn, Tajzadeh considers efforts aimed at full implementation of the current constitution when, drawing on the same text, the country's leadership is pursuing a course towards individual and possibly a hereditary rule as a setback. He is convinced of the need to curb this trend before the transition of power to the next supreme leader. In Tajadeh's view, it is the constitution that sets the general direction for the socio-political development of society. Therefore, although the change of the constitution is not an ultimate solution to every issue, the majority of political issues in today's Iran stem from the text of the current constitution, which lays the basis for an arbitrary rule. Furthermore, Tajadeh seems to be more optimistic about public farsightedness. In line with Hajarian, he deems constitutional referendum to be a double-edged sword, but in contrast to his vis-a-vis, he believes that if the leadership tries to pass amendments notwithstanding the opinion of the majority of citizens, in the current climate, the citizens will turn this referendum into a vote against the authorities. There is a consensus between both Tajadeh and Hajarian on the impossibility of carrying out broad political reforms in the current climate of crackdown and conservation of power. But Tajadeh believes that the current course will inevitably lead the authorities to a dead end, and it is during this borderline period that the country's leadership will be forced to seek compromise and reconciliation to avoid social turmoil. Until then, Tajadeh argues, the reformists need to refine the discourse of structural reforms so that at the required time they have viable alternatives that would appeal to the majority of Iranians. As Milton Friedman put it, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. In conclusion, it is not clear whether the notion of structural reforms has the potential to become a significant breakpoint in the revival of the reformist discourse, or it would be sidelined as yet another vague concept. So far, it seems that there is no real advocate force for this idea, since the mainstream reformists eschew Tajadeh's approach, considering him too radical, while Tajadeh himself was arrested on the 8th of July and to this day remains in pre-trial detention at the notorious Evin prison. However, the idea of structural reforms could be seen as a middle ground for the reform revolution dichotomy intrinsic to the opposition camp in Iran. While radical in scope and peaceful in realization, it certainly represents a conceptual landmark that could potentially contribute to the process of discourse production for the unhinged reformists and offer an optimistic outlook to their demoralized constituency. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Perfect. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you very much to all three panelists for really three very interesting and important topics. Floor is open for questions. If there are questions, yes, sir.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I have in fact three short and direct questions. The two first one is for the first panelist. To what extent do you really think that the real change started in 2009 and not in 2020? Because all this restrictions on authoritarian or electoral authoritarianism started in fact in 2009. My second question to you, to what extent in fact do you think it's not really about regime change, but rather about personalization of the regime change, as you know probably that according to Barbara Geddes, you may have change in the regime. You don't necessarily need to have a regime change to have higher level of personalization. My third question is for the second panelist. What we learned from nationalist studies it is not enough to say that, okay, you should vote for me because I am Kurdish or I am Azeri, etc. To that message, to be successful, you have to link it to some kind of grievances. You know, you should vote for me because I am Turkish, because you as Iranian Turkish, you suffer, you have grievances, are not taken by the regime because you are Turkish. I think you should not be sure about the future. You know, if the future you have like political leader who are able to link these cultural identities or ethnic identities to some kind of grievances. And just if we look to the history, what happens in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, what happened in many European countries, it is not just about saying that I am Turkish or I am Azeri, you should vote for me, but to what extent as a candidate you are able to link this identity to some kind of grievances. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a question here in front here.
I'm Bernard Hourcade from Paris, a Center for the Middle East, or Iranian world. The first question to Mr. Mahdavi. I do agree with you that Iran is a dictatorship, hegemonic power, and so on and so forth, but Iran is also a republic. And so I think that what happened in 2021 is the fact that with 16% of blank votes, something new happened in Iran, a democratic move in Iran. And that, I think, is an important fact. We know everything about dictatorship in Iran, so nothing new, but a blank vote is a new fact. The second question for Mr. Ahmadi, I do agree with you with the strength of nationalism in Iran, which unified all the different cultures since before Islam until now. But don't you think that currently the most important division, political division, geographical division, is because of religion, Sunni and Shias? And the political opposition, we can see, is no longer ethnical. The Turks and the Azeri are voting exactly like the people of Yazd or Isfahan. But in Kurdistan, in Sunni Kurdistan, or in Arabic Kurdistan, in Sunni Arab region where people are speaking Arabic, in the Persian Gulf especially, or in Baluchistan, this is a new political dynamic in Iran and no longer ethnicity. Third question for Mr. Mirzoev. You spoke about the ideology of the reformists. I do agree with you with all the difficulties they have. Don't you think that the collapse of the reformists is because the lack of relations they have with the population, with the new population? They are still living on the beginning revolution about the constitution, and it is no longer the problem of Iranian, of the 80 million of people living in the country. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Why don't we take one more, Dr. Ahmad?
شكرا للدكتور مروان، شكرا للدكتور مهران، وشكرا للمتحدثين.
Dr. Mehran. My question is addressed to Dr. Hamid. Can I speak to you in Arabic? Yes? Okay. I think the professor understands Arabic. So you've said that there are no ethnicities and tribes that have called for independence in the yesteryears. Does this apply to the Arabs in Khuzestan or the Ahwaz? Because there are certain movements that are demanding independence and self-determination. There are movements who are calling for equality as well and integration in the political life, the social life in Iran. Another question. You've said that there are Azeris, Turks, Kurds, and other ethnicities, and some candidates have failed because they depended on such electorates. Do you think that this can be applied, or do you think that there are any candidates that have tapped into the Arab nationality in Iran during the latest
just one last one, and then if there's time, we'll take a second.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is to Mr. Hamidi. It's about Azerbaijan nationalism in Iran. And as I know, as I observed, Azerbaijan nationalism is unlike other Kurdish or Arabic or Baluchi nationalism. Azerbaijan nationalists don't have the armed struggle against Iran. And they don't have such an organization or movement which trying to separate from Iran in an armed way, in struggling with military. And how would you explain this phenomenon? My question is this.
Thank you. If I could ask the panelists to keep their responses brief, maybe we can get to the other questions that exist. We'll start with you, Amir.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the first question, the comparison between 2009 election and 2021 election. I think in terms of regime type, it would be hard to define 2009 election as a critical junction in terms of the changing the electoral authoritarian system to hegemonic authoritarian system. 2009 election, the election was contested. The reformist was in election. They campaigned with two candidates. According to the official result of the election, the second candidate of the election, the former Prime Minister Mir Musavi, gained 30% of votes. This time we saw that the second ranked was belonging to the blank votes, and the third was 11%, who was Mohsen Rezai, not the reformists. He is basically the vice president of the current President Raisi. So in any mean, the election was not contested, although there was green movement and all of the electoral disputes after that, but the regime showed enthusiasm about the high turnout. Afterward, after 4 years, we had another contested election of President Rouhani in 2013, and I want to highlight the fact that the role of IRGC in the governance 13 years ago, actually, in 2009, I think it's not fair to compare that role with its current role. As I said in my presentation, I think no one can govern Iran without cooperation and without coordination with IRGC anymore. So its expansion in every part of the government that challenged the notion of the elected administration itself. And I want to highlight the fact that the second term of President Rouhani has many evidence about this shift toward the hegemonic authoritarian system. Rouhani came to power, second term assumed office with the historic 24 million votes. He left office with about 6% popularity. His government, when he left the office, was marginalized, paralyzed, and almost bankrupt in every aspect. No popularity, no power in the top of and the core of the regime, no negotiation power with the supreme leader and the core of the regime, no good reputation in terms of its power of committing to its promises from outside, from the regional partners and from the West, and so on and so forth. So that is why I talked about the shift in the nature of regime. And regarding your second question about regime change, I didn't talk about regime change. I talked about the different type, the new regime type. So when we ground the evidence in the context of comparative politics, as I mentioned in the title of my paper, I argue and make this question: if 2021 election can be recognized and identified as a critical juncture for applying and employing new terminology to discuss and analyze Islamic Republic. And the last question was about blank votes. That was true. As I said, the second place in the election result, alongside with the lowest participation rate in the presidential election. That was like a new way of indication and demonstration of dissatisfaction of the people of voters with the electoral process and what is going on about the government in whole.
Thank you very much. Yes, yes. Related to yes. Can you turn on the mic?
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, the first question about was raised from there about that those candidates who raised the question of ethnicity should not concentrate on being ethnic or ethnicity, but to talk about the grievances of people. That is true, but the problem is that the people recognize who the candidate is, what is the background, what is the political trends of him or her. Basically, the male candidates have been raised that question. And if a candidate come and raise the political, economic, or social grievances, which is general to Iran, get more votes, and at the same time raise the local grievances like cultural or the other things, they are more successful. But because most of the candidates, they have the perception that they can use the ethnic votes and basically concentrate on ethnic issues rather than other issues, they fail. The second question was about the issue of ethnicity. That is true, as you said. At the present time, the question is not basically ethnicity. It is more in the Islamic Republic the question of religion and this Shi'i-Sunni problem. Basically, if you look at the Iranian ethnic groups, like in Baluchis are mostly Sunnis and Azeris are Shias, and then Kurds, majority of them are Sunnis, and in Khuzestan basically the Arabs are Shiites. The issue of Shia Sunni is more important, especially in the Baluchistan, which is like Pakistani Baluchistan. The issue of religion and especially the Salafi trends have dominated the ethnicity, and they have marginalized former ethnic groups, political organization. So the religious leaders are more important. The same is true regarding Iran. The third question was about the Khuzestan. You know what I was saying, that formerly we didn't have monolithic ethnic groups. The society was divided as tribes. That was true also for Khuzestan. For example, I give the example, when the Sheikh Azal, the problem was raised, and the Reza Shah wanted to disarm him, many Iranian Arab tribes cooperated with Reza Shah because Sheikh Azal belonged to Ka'abi, Al Ka'ab, but many other Iranian Arab tribes like Bani Turuf and Bani Kasir and lots of them cooperated with Reza Shah. The same was in Kurdistan, because the question of, because the ethnicity is not the dominant trend in Iran. It is promoted by political organization, and those political organizations do not represent all the people, all the Iranian Arab people. That is the true. Actually, I didn't get the last part of your question, because the word murashah, I didn't know what did it mean. candidate. Yes, you know, in Khuzestan, because they resort to violence and terrorism and those things, they are mostly isolated from Iran. Not only the majority Farsi-speaking group, but the Azeris, the Kurds, and everywhere, they are against them because Khuzestan is the strategic part of Iran in terms of economy, geopolitics. So they would not be successful. But you know, in terms of culture and those things, the Arabic language is dominant in Iran right now. You know, everybody knows Arabic, from schools to the universities, and the people are saying what they want. If the issue of language is there, Arabic has been dominant in Iran. We are all speaking. For the Azeri issue, why they are not resorting to armed struggle? Yes, that is because Azeris are dispersed everywhere in Iran. You know, everywhere you go, you will see Azeris. And it doesn't mean the Azeri nationalism as this is a popular movement among the Azeris. On the other side, the Iranian nationalism is dominant. You know, mostly 90% of the theoretician of Iranian nationalism and pan-Iranism have been Azeris, and I can name them. And this is a fact that the people in Republic of Azerbaijan, they don't understand. At the present time, the leader of pan-Iranist party he was a student of mine in Tehran, and he's outside, I think. He's from Ardabil. He is Azerbaijani. It is an ultra-Iranian nationalism. So this is the fact. The majority of Azeris in Iran are loyal to Iran, and they have been. But unfortunately, there is another image outside of Iran of that.
Thank you very much.
So Professor Urkat has correctly pointed out the loss of connection between the reformists and their constituents, and I agree with you. In fact, in the full paper, I go in detail on this subject. But in general, reformists, the initial reformist strategy was dubbed as pressure from below, negotiations from the top. So far, the reformists tried to avoid organization of protests and mass mobilization because they are afraid of the excessive political participation. They are afraid that this protest will go out of hand, and there will be no guarantee that in such a volatile environment it will be the reformists to advocate for the popular will. So basically they rather than relying on civil society, they prefer elitist maneuvering. And in general, all opposition forces in any authoritarian regime tend to water down their critique and their rhetoric in order to remain a legitimate political force and to avoid elimination. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one last very quick question, and it goes to Ms. Hamida Dorzadeh. You're the only thing that's standing between us and lunch. So.
Thank you, Dr. Kamrava, and thank you for the great presentations. I have, in fact, two questions. So, and both are directed to Dr. Ahmadi. The first one is, how do we explain politicization of ethnicity in Iran beyond elections? Second, is the notion of Iranianness, this belonging to historical Iran, the only factor for the failure of politicization of ethnicity? What about the agency of these ethnic groups that you're talking about? Thank you.
Yeah. What was the first question? Sorry, I just...
I was asking...
Oh, yeah, yes. The factors for politicization of ethnicity. I explained in the paper that there have been three factors in present-day Iran in the 20th century. One was the rise of the modern state. When the modern state came to power, they disarmed the tribal groups. So the tribes were marginalized, and because they had participation in the state, the modern state prevented them. And because the modern state didn't build a modern democratic structures in terms of democracy. So the former tribal leaders resorted to a question of ethnicity to revive their power structure before, when they were tribal groups. And because of that, if you look at the most leaders of the ethnic groups in Iran, in Kurdistan, in Sistan and Baluchistan and Khuzestan, are the sons or the grandsons of the former tribal leaders. So that was, the tribes were marginalized, and the modern state did not create a modern structure of democratic politics. The second is international politics. You know, we know how Soviet Union have been promoted the idea of ethnic self-determination, how they created the Azerbaijan Republic in Iran and Kurdistan Republic in Iran during the World War II, and then how Iraq was supporting the Khuzestan in other things in Baluchistan, and also Iran has supported the Iraqi Kurds. And so international factor at the time being, these ethnic groups around the region. Republic of Azerbaijan is supporting Azeri nationalism in Iran. Saudi Arabia, maybe United Arab Emirates, I don't know, I'm not quite sure, but Saudis, I am sure that they are supporting the issue of ethnicity, the Kurds, and they pay money, and they hope that they do something. But because they don't have this strong historical background of Iranian identity, they fail. And the second is, the third is elite, that I explained how elites. The second question was, what was that, Hamida? Agency, yes, that is included in the elite, the factor of elite. Elites, the ethnic elites who have been very active in the 20th century Iran.
Perfect. Thank you very much. This has been fantastic. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you very much. Join us for lunch at our restaurant cafeteria, and then we'll reconvene here at 2 for a second set of panels for today. Thank you.